Pretend to be my husband for 1 year. The words hung in the air of the 42nd floor conference room like a line no one expected to hear in a board meeting. Every conversation stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Laptops went still. At the head of the long walnut table stood Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Dynamics, the kind of woman business magazines called unstoppable and employees quietly called intimidating. Her posture was perfectly straight, her navy blazer sharp enough to look like armor under the bright white lights of the room. And the person she was looking at wasn't a director, wasn't a senior executive, and definitely wasn't anyone who expected to be the center of attention that morning. It was Ethan Parker. Ethan sat near the far end of the table with a simple legal pad, a company pen, and the quiet habit of someone used to being overlooked. His shirt sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms. His tie was slightly loosened, the way it always was after dropping his daughter off at school and racing across downtown traffic to make the morning briefing. People in the office knew two things about Ethan Parker. First, he never stayed late past 5:30. Second, he never talked about why. Victoria's eyes didn't move from him. Calm. Certain. The kind of calm that made the entire room uneasy. 1 year, she repeated, as if clarifying a business proposal. A quiet ripple of confused laughter moved around the table. Someone assumed it had to be a joke. Another executive leaned toward his colleague and whispered something that ended with a chuckle. But Ethan didn't laugh. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with a thoughtful stillness that didn't match the tension filling the room. 3 seconds passed. Then 4. Finally he spoke, his voice even and surprisingly relaxed. All right, Ethan said slowly. But I've got one question. A few people leaned forward, expecting him to refuse, or at least challenge the idea. Victoria folded her arms lightly, curious now. Go ahead. Ethan nodded once, like a man clarifying the terms of a contract. So we're sharing a bed? The room went silent. Not awkward silent. Real silent. The kind where even the low hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded loud. Someone in the corner coughed and quickly stopped. Victoria blinked once, clearly not expecting that. Response. For a moment, the iron-willed CEO of a billion-dollar company actually looked surprised. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply waited, hands folded calmly on the table. Across the glass walls of the conference room, employees walking through the hallway slowed their steps, sensing the strange tension inside. Victoria finally exhaled through her nose, something almost like amusement flickering in her eyes. No, she said coolly. We're not sharing a bed. A few nervous laughs escaped around the table, but Ethan just nodded thoughtfully. Good, he replied. My daughter already thinks my couch is too small. That single sentence shifted something in the room. Several executives glanced at one another. Victoria's gaze sharpened slightly, like she had just been reminded why she chose him in the first place. Because Ethan Parker was the only man in the entire company who could sit in front of her, hear a sentence that could change his life, and answer without fear, without flattery, and without pretending to be impressed. Outside the tall windows, the late morning sun reflected off the skyline of Chicago, pouring light across the polished table. Victoria stepped closer, resting her fingertips against the wood. Mr. Parker, she said quietly, this arrangement would benefit both of us. Ethan tilted his head a fraction. I figured there was a reason. Another long pause settled across the room, the kind that made everyone feel like they were watching the beginning of something none of them understood yet. Victoria's voice softened, just slightly. Trust me, she said. This proposal is more serious than you think. And somewhere in the quiet stillness of that glass conference room, the lives of two very different people had just begun to shift in ways neither of them could see coming. Victoria Hale did not answer Ethan immediately. Instead, she looked around the conference room slowly, her sharp gray eyes passing over every director, every senior manager, every curious face that had suddenly forgotten about quarterly projections and profit margins. The quiet stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. Then she spoke again, her voice steady and calm, like someone presenting a strategic acquisition instead of a life-altering request. Everyone except Mr. Parker can return to work. Chairs shifted instantly. Laptops snapped closed. No one argued with Victoria Hale. Within seconds, the long conference table emptied, leaving only the faint scent of coffee and the quiet echo of footsteps disappearing down the hallway. Ethan remained seated exactly where he was, his hands still resting on the legal pad in front of him. He watched the glass door close behind the last executive before he leaned back slightly in his chair. "You cleared the room," he said. "That usually means this conversation is about to get expensive." Victoria did not smile, but there was a flicker of appreciation in her eyes. She walked to the window overlooking downtown Chicago, the late morning sun reflecting across miles of glass towers and busy streets below. Taxis crawled through traffic. A commuter train slid past the river like a silver ribbon. For a moment she said nothing at all. When she finally turned back toward him, the confident CO tone was still there, but something quieter sat beneath it now. "You are a single father," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Yes. You leave this building every day at 5:30 sharp." Another nod. "Correct. And every employee in this company believes you are simply an average operations analyst." Ethan folded his arms lightly. "That sounds about right." Victoria walked back toward the table and placed a thin black folder in front of him. The soft sound of paper touching wood echoed in the quiet room. "But I read your file," she continued. Ethan did not reach for the folder yet. People usually do when they plan to make unusual job offers. Victoria tapped the cover once. "You graduated from Northwestern Law School. Top 10% of your class." Ethan's expression did not change, but his eyes moved to the folder now. "That was a long time ago. You worked 4 years in corporate litigation," she added. "Then suddenly you left the profession and took an entry-level operations job here." Ethan exhaled slowly. Life changes. Victoria studied him carefully, as if weighing every unspoken piece of that answer. Then she spoke the words that changed the air in the room again. "My board of directors is trying to remove me." Ethan blinked once. Not shocked, just attentive now. Victoria continued. "They claim the company needs stability." Their exact words. She made a small quotation gesture with her fingers. "Stable leadership. Stable public image. Stable personal life." Ethan finally opened the folder. Inside was a neatly printed document, thick with legal language and signatures waiting to exist. "Marriage contract." He read quietly. Victoria nodded. "If I am married, the board loses their strongest argument." Ethan flipped a page slowly. "And you want me to play the role of husband?" "For 1 year," she said. "Public appearances, corporate events, photographs. Nothing more complicated than that." Ethan closed the folder halfway and looked at her again. "You could hire an actor." Victoria shook her head. "Actors cannot pass background investigations from corporate attorneys." "You could date someone rich." "Rich men want control." Ethan leaned back again, thinking. Outside the window, a helicopter moved slowly across the skyline, its distant hum barely audible through the thick glass. Victoria watched him with careful patience. Finally, Ethan asked the question that mattered. "Why me?" Victoria's answer came without hesitation. "Because you are the only person in this company who does not want anything from me." The words landed quietly between them. Ethan glanced down at the contract again. Page after page of legal structure. Clear terms. Clear exit date. 1 year. He ran a hand across the back of his neck before speaking again. "You realize this could complicate my life." Victoria nodded. "That is why the compensation is significant." Ethan did not ask how much. Instead, he asked something else. "And after 1 year?" Victoria met his eyes calmly. "After 1 year, the contract ends. We shake hands. Our lives return to normal." The room went silent again, but this time it felt different. Like the slow beginning of a decision neither of them fully understood yet. Ethan Parker did not sign the contract that afternoon. He placed the black folder back on the polished conference table, stood up slowly, and said only one thing before leaving the room. "I need to think about it." Victoria Hale did not try to stop him. She simply nodded once, as if she had expected that answer from the beginning. By 5:30 that evening, the glass towers of downtown Chicago had begun to glow with the soft orange light of sunset. Ethan's car moved steadily through traffic, past crowded sidewalks and glowing storefronts, until the tall buildings slowly gave way to quieter streets lined with maple trees and small brick houses. His home sat near the end of a narrow street where bicycles leaned against fences and porch lights flickered on as the sky darkened. It was not a large house. 2 bedrooms. A small front yard. A white mailbox slightly crooked from too many winters. But when Ethan stepped through the front door, the air inside carried the warm smell of tomato soup and toasted bread. "Daddy," A small voice called instantly from the kitchen. Lily Parker ran across the wooden floor with the unstoppable energy of a 10-year-old who had been waiting all afternoon. Her blonde hair bounced around her shoulders as she wrapped her arms around him. Ethan laughed softly and lifted her off the ground for a moment. "Hey kiddo," he said. "Did you finish your homework?" Lily nodded proudly. "All of it. Even the math worksheet." Ethan set her back down and hung his jacket on the hook by the door. The kitchen light glowed warmly above the small table where 2 bowls of soup waited beside a stack of grilled cheese sandwiches. Lily climbed back onto her chair, swinging her legs slightly under the table. "You are late today," she said, narrowing her eyes like a tiny detective. Ethan sat across from her and picked up his spoon. "Big meeting at work." Lily studied him carefully. Was it a good meeting or a weird meeting? Ethan paused. He smiled faintly. "A little weird." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer and dipped her sandwich into her soup. The quiet comfort of the small kitchen settled around them. Outside the window, a street lamp buzzed softly to life, casting pale yellow light across the sidewalk. For a few minutes, neither of them said much. Just the quiet sound of spoons against bowls and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. But Ethan's mind kept drifting back to the black folder sitting in his briefcase in the hallway. 1 year. A fake marriage. Public events. Corporate photographs. A life that was not real. Lily suddenly looked up again. "Daddy." "Yes." "Miss Henderson said we might have a field trip to Washington next spring." Ethan nodded. "That sounds exciting." Lily stirred her soup slowly before speaking again, a little quieter this time. She said it costs $600. The number sat quietly in the room between them. Ethan kept his voice calm. "We will figure it out." Lily smiled and returned to her sandwich, trusting him the way children trust the people who promise them the world will always work out. After dinner, Ethan washed the dishes while Lily sat on the couch drawing in her sketchbook. The television murmured softly in the background, some nature documentary about mountains and rivers. Eventually Lily yawned, rubbed her eyes, and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Ethan checked on her 10 minutes later. She was already asleep, her sketchbook still open beside her pillow with a half-finished drawing of a castle and 2 tiny stick figures standing in front of it. Ethan gently pulled the blanket over her shoulder and turned off the lamp. The house fell quiet again. Downstairs he walked to the hallway, opened his briefcase, and pulled out the black folder. The contract felt heavier now than it had in the conference room. He sat at the small kitchen table under the yellow light and opened it again. Page after page of legal terms. 1 year of pretending. 1 year of living inside someone else's world. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked toward the staircase where Lily slept peacefully in her room. Finally, he whispered to the empty kitchen, almost as if testing the words out loud. 1 year. The next morning arrived quietly, the pale blue light of early dawn slipping through the kitchen window as Ethan Parker sat alone at the small wooden table. The black folder rested in front of him, open again, the same pages he had read 3 times the night before, now waiting for a 4th. The house was still. Upstairs Lily was asleep, her door slightly open the way she liked it, so the hallway light could reach the edge of her room. Ethan rubbed his eyes and exhaled slowly. 1 year. He looked at the final page again, where a blank line waited for his name. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street, and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked once before settling again. Ethan closed the folder and stood up, pouring coffee into a chipped white mug that read "World's Okayest Dad." Lily had given it to him for Father's Day last year. He smiled faintly at the memory and leaned against the counter. "Daddy." Lily's sleepy voice floated down the hallway. Ethan turned just as she appeared in the doorway in oversized pajamas, her hair messy and her eyes half open. "Morning, kiddo," he said gently. Lily walked into the kitchen and climbed onto her usual chair. "You look like you did not sleep very much," she said with surprising seriousness. Ethan chuckled softly. "Big decisions sometimes keep people awake." Lily rested her chin in her hands. "Is it about work again?" Ethan considered the question. He walked to the table, sat down across from her, and folded his hands. "Sort of," he admitted. Lily watched him carefully, the way children sometimes do when they know something important is happening even if they do not fully understand it. "Is it a good decision or a scary decision?" she asked. Ethan thought about Victoria Hale standing in that bright conference room with absolute confidence. He thought about the board of directors trying to force her out. He thought about the contract that could change everything for both of them. Finally, he answered honestly. Maybe both. Lily nodded thoughtfully, as if that made perfect sense. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You always figure things out, she said simply. A few hours later, the city was alive again with the rhythm of morning traffic. Ethan parked his car beneath the towering glass building of Hale Dynamics and stepped into the lobby where polished marble floors reflected the bright sunlight pouring through the enormous windows. Employees hurried past with coffee cups and laptops, the quiet buzz of another corporate morning already filling the air. Ethan walked calmly toward the elevator, the black folder tucked under his arm. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor with a soft chime. Outside Victoria Hale's office, her assistant looked up from a desk stacked with files. Good morning, Mr. Parker, she said politely. She is expecting you. Ethan nodded once and walked to the tall wooden door. For a brief moment he paused, then knocked lightly. Come in, Victoria's voice answered from inside. The office was bright with natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Chicago River. Victoria stood near the window, reviewing something on a tablet, her posture composed and confident as always. When she looked up and saw Ethan, her eyes moved immediately to the folder in his hand. Good morning, Mr. Parker, she said. Did you sleep on it? Ethan stepped forward and placed the folder on her desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the office felt almost ceremonial, like the pause before a judge announces a verdict. Finally, Ethan opened the folder, turned the final page toward himself, and picked up the pen resting beside it. He signed his name carefully on the line. The ink dried in less than 2 seconds, but somehow the moment felt longer than that. Ethan set the pen down and closed the folder again. Victoria looked at the signature, then back at him. So, she said calmly, welcome to the most unusual partnership of your life. Ethan folded his arms lightly and met her steady gaze. 1 year, he replied. Victoria nodded once. 1 year. Neither of them realized that from that moment forward, pretending was going to be the hardest part. The news traveled through Hale Dynamics faster than the morning coffee carts. By noon, the entire building had heard the rumor. By 3 o'clock, most employees believed it was true. By 5 o'clock, it was confirmed. Victoria Hale, the famously private CEO of Hale Dynamics, was married. The official company announcement was short and carefully written. Victoria Hale had recently married Ethan Parker in a private ceremony. No photographs. No interviews. No additional details. The message ended with a simple request for privacy. But privacy was not something corporate America respected very well. Inside the executive floor, the atmosphere felt different now. Conversations stopped when Ethan walked past. Assistants glanced up from their desks. A few employees tried to act normal, but curiosity moved through the halls like electricity. Ethan Parker remained exactly the same man he had been the week before. Same calm walk. Same rolled sleeves. Same quiet presence that made him easy to overlook if someone was not paying attention. But Victoria Hale's assistant noticed something subtle when Ethan entered the executive corridor that afternoon. He did not look nervous. Most people looked nervous around Victoria Hale. Ethan simply looked thoughtful. The assistant picked up the phone on her desk. She is ready for you, Mr. Parker. Ethan nodded once and walked toward the office door. Inside, Victoria Hale stood near the long conference table reviewing a schedule displayed on a large digital screen. When Ethan entered, she turned toward him with the composed confidence that had built a billion-dollar company. Our first public appearance is tonight, she said. Ethan closed the door behind him. That was fast. Victoria gave a small nod. The board of directors scheduled a charity gala months ago. Canceling would raise questions. Ethan walked closer to the screen and read the event description. The Hale Foundation Annual Scholarship Dinner. Location, the Grand Regency Hotel Ballroom. Time, 7:30 this evening. Formal event, Ethan said quietly. Victoria crossed her arms. Black tie. Ethan looked down at his own work clothes, then back at her. I assume I am not wearing this. For the first time that day, Victoria smiled slightly. Absolutely not. She tapped the tablet in her hand, and the office door opened almost immediately. 2 assistants entered carrying garment bags. One held a tailored black tuxedo. The other carried a polished pair of dress shoes that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly grocery bill. Ethan looked at the clothing, then back at Victoria. You prepared all of this already? Victoria's answer was calm. When someone signs a marriage contract with a CEO, preparation becomes necessary. Ethan lifted one eyebrow. You move fast. Victoria tilted her head slightly. That is how I stayed in this office. The assistants placed the garment bags on the couch and quietly left the room. For a moment the office was silent again except for the distant hum of the city outside the tall windows. Ethan walked to the couch and unzipped the tuxedo bag. The suit inside was simple, elegant, and clearly designed by someone who understood expensive tailoring. You realize people are going to stare at us tonight, Ethan said. Victoria nodded once. That is the entire point. Ethan ran a hand across the sleeve of the jacket, feeling the smooth fabric. Let me guess. Hand-holding. Smiling. Looking like the happiest married couple in Chicago. Victoria stepped closer and looked directly at him. You catch on quickly. Ethan turned toward her again. One more question. Victoria folded her arms lightly. Yes. Ethan spoke in the same calm tone he had used in the conference room days earlier. Your mansion has more than one bedroom, right? Victoria blinked once, then sighed quietly. Mr. Parker. Ethan smiled faintly. Just making sure. For a brief second something almost like amusement crossed Victoria Hale's normally unshakable expression. Then she straightened her posture again and looked toward the evening skyline outside the windows where the city lights were beginning to glow. We leave for the gala in 1 hour, she said. Ethan picked up the tuxedo and nodded. Then I guess I should go meet my new life. And somewhere between the bright lights of that corporate tower and the quiet house, where Lily Parker waited for him each night, Ethan Parker was about to step into a world where pretending to be a husband might be the easiest part of the story. The Grand Regency Hotel stood glowing against the Chicago night like a palace of glass and light. Valets moved quickly along the circular driveway as luxury cars rolled to the entrance one after another. Camera flashes flickered near the red carpet where reporters quietly waited for the city's most powerful names to appear. Inside the Blacktown car approaching the entrance, Ethan Parker adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo jacket and glanced out the window at the towering hotel doors. This is not my usual Friday night, he said calmly. Across from him, Victoria Hale sat perfectly composed in an elegant dark blue evening gown that reflected the city lights each time the car passed beneath a street lamp. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were focused, the same way they looked before a major corporate negotiation. You will do fine, she replied. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You sound very confident for someone who married an operations analyst 3 days ago. Victoria looked at him with the faintest hint of amusement. I did not marry an operations analyst, she said quietly. I married a former corporate lawyer who prefers to stay invisible. Ethan exhaled slowly. Invisible sounds good right now. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the hotel entrance. Outside, the sound of conversation and camera shutters floated through the night air. A valet opened the door and the cool evening breeze rushed in. Victoria stepped out first with practiced elegance, her expression instantly transforming into the poised public face the business world knew so well. Ethan followed a second later, adjusting his jacket as the bright lights of the entrance reflected across the polished marble steps. For a moment the reporters did not recognize him. Then one of them spoke. That is him. Cameras lifted immediately. Microphones appeared. The quiet murmur of the crowd turned into a wave of curiosity. Victoria did not hesitate. She turned toward Ethan and gently placed her hand on his arm, the movement smooth and natural as if they had been doing it for years. Smile, she whispered under her breath. Ethan leaned slightly closer. You realize this is the part where I regret signing the contract. Victoria's lips curved just slightly as the cameras flashed again. Together they walked through the entrance into the vast ballroom of the Grand Regency where hundreds of guests stood beneath crystal chandeliers that shimmered like stars above the polished floor. The Hale Foundation Scholarship Dinner was already in full motion. Business leaders, investors, journalists, and city officials filled the room in formal attire, their conversations forming a steady hum beneath the soft music of a string quartet playing near the stage. When Victoria Hale entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. People turned. Conversations paused. Several board members standing near the center table exchanged surprised glances. Victoria guided Ethan forward with calm confidence. Welcome to the part of my life where everyone watches everything. she said quietly. Ethan looked around the ballroom slowly, taking in the towering chandeliers, the perfectly arranged tables, and the countless eyes now studying him. I can feel that, he replied. One of the board directors approached them with a polite but clearly curious smile. Victoria, the man said, you have been full of surprises lately. Victoria nodded politely. Good evening, Harold. Harold's eyes moved to Ethan. And this must be the mysterious husband. Ethan extended his hand calmly. Ethan Parker. Nice to meet you. The handshake lasted exactly 2 seconds, but the man's curious expression lingered longer than that. Several other executives gathered nearby, pretending to greet Victoria while quietly observing the man beside her. Ethan noticed every glance, every whisper, every subtle attempt to understand who he was and how he had suddenly appeared in Victoria Hale's life. He leaned slightly toward her again and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. You were right, he said. Victoria kept her gaze forward. About what? Ethan gave the faintest smile. Everyone is definitely watching. Across the ballroom, the members of the board of directors stood near the stage, their expressions unreadable as they studied the couple standing beneath the chandelier light. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Hale allowed herself the smallest moment of quiet satisfaction because the plan was working exactly the way she intended. The music in the Grand Regency ballroom softened as the evening progressed, the quiet melody of the string quartet drifting beneath the steady murmur of conversation and clinking glasses. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the polished floor, reflecting in hundreds of silver utensils and champagne flutes. Ethan Parker stood beside Victoria Hale near the center table reserved for the foundation's board members, his posture relaxed but observant. Every few seconds another guest approached to greet the famous CEO and discreetly evaluate the unexpected man at her side. Victoria, a tall woman in an emerald dress, said with a polite smile, I heard the news this afternoon. Congratulations. Victoria returned the smile with practiced grace. Thank you, Melissa. The woman's attention shifted to Ethan. And you must be the man who surprised half of Chicago this week. Ethan extended his hand calmly. Ethan Parker. Nice to meet you. The woman shook his hand briefly, still studying him with curious eyes before drifting away into the crowd. Ethan leaned slightly closer to Victoria. Your co-workers are very subtle, he murmured. Victoria did not turn her head, but her voice carried quiet amusement. They are trying not to interrogate you in public. Across the ballroom, a small group of board members remained gathered near the stage. Their conversation looked serious. One of them, Harold Whitmore, occasionally glanced in Ethan's direction as if trying to solve a puzzle that did not yet make sense. Ethan noticed it too. That man over there, he said quietly. He looks like he just swallowed a lemon. Victoria followed his gaze briefly. Harold Whitmore, she replied. Vice chairman of the board. He prefers predictability. Ethan gave a faint smile. Then I imagine I am ruining his evening. Victoria lifted a glass of sparkling water. That was part of the strategy. A few minutes later, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. The soft music faded and the guests gradually moved toward their tables. A large screen behind the stage displayed photographs of students who had received scholarships through the Hale Foundation. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to respectful attention. Victoria and Ethan took their seats at the front table while servers quietly placed dinner plates before the guests. Ethan studied the room for a moment, watching the board members, the investors, the journalists. You know, he said softly, this might actually work. Victoria looked at him with mild curiosity. What makes you say that? Ethan nodded toward the board table across the room. They are not whispering anymore. Now, they are thinking. Victoria followed his glance and noticed the subtle change as well. The directors who had been quietly planning her removal now appeared uncertain. Their strongest argument had always been stability. And now the woman they accused of living too independently had suddenly presented a husband who appeared calm, intelligent, and completely unafraid of their scrutiny. Interesting, Victoria said quietly. The master of ceremonies began speaking about the foundation's mission, but Ethan's attention remained on the room itself. Years earlier, he had spent long nights in corporate law offices studying the behavior of powerful people. He recognized the quiet tension spreading through the ballroom now. A few minutes later, Harold Whitmore rose from his chair and approached their table. The man carried the polite smile of someone who preferred control but had not yet regained it. "Victoria," he said evenly, "you did not mention that you were seeing someone." Victoria placed her napkin neatly beside her plate. It happened quickly. Harold turned his attention to Ethan. "Mr. Parker, is it?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes, sir." Harold studied him carefully. "And what exactly do you do for a living?" The surrounding tables fell slightly quieter, several guests pretending not to listen while clearly listening very closely. Ethan answered calmly, "I work at Hale Dynamics." Harold raised an eyebrow. "In what department?" Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Operations." The word hung in the air for a moment. Then Ethan added one more sentence, his voice still relaxed. "Although I used to work in corporate law." The silence at the table deepened just slightly as Harold Whitmore realized that the quiet man standing beside Victoria Hale might understand the board's strategies better than anyone in the room. And somewhere behind Victoria's composed expression, a small realization formed. Her unusual husband might be far more useful than she originally planned. Harold Whitmore did not immediately respond to Ethan's last sentence. The vice chairman of the board simply studied him for a moment longer, as if recalculating something that had suddenly become more complicated. Around them the ballroom continued to glow with warm light and quiet conversation, but at the front table a subtle tension settled into the air. Finally Harold gave a slow nod. "Corporate law," he repeated. "That is an interesting career shift." Ethan rested his hands calmly on the edge of the table. Life sometimes requires different priorities. Harold's eyes moved briefly to Victoria, then back to Ethan. "Indeed it does." The man offered a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes before stepping away and returning to the cluster of board members near the stage. As soon as he was out of earshot, Ethan leaned slightly toward Victoria. "He is reconsidering his entire strategy right now," Ethan said quietly. Victoria did not look at him, but her voice carried quiet curiosity. "You are very certain of that?" Ethan nodded toward the board table across the room. "Watch their body language." Victoria followed his gaze subtly. The directors who had been speaking confidently earlier now leaned together in quieter conversation. One of them gestured toward Ethan while another shook his head slowly. Victoria allowed herself the smallest breath of satisfaction. "You may be right." The evening program continued as the Master of Ceremonies introduced several scholarship recipients who spoke briefly about their education and future goals. Applause moved through the ballroom after each speech, warm and genuine. But beneath the applause, another story was unfolding quietly among the executives and investors watching the front table. Victoria Hale, the famously independent CEO many believed was too unpredictable to lead a global corporation, now appeared beside a husband who spoke calmly, listened carefully, and seemed to understand the world of corporate power just as well as the directors trying to challenge her authority. Ethan Parker noticed the shift clearly. Several investors approached their table during the next break in the program. One man in a silver tie introduced himself as the founder of a venture capital firm. Another woman represented a major Chicago banking group. Each conversation began the same way. "Congratulations on the marriage." Each conversation ended with a polite but curious attempt to understand who Ethan Parker really was. Ethan answered every question simply. He spoke about his work in operations. He mentioned raising his daughter. He avoided discussing his past career in detail, but the calm intelligence in his answers left a strong impression. At one point, an elderly investor leaned toward Victoria with a quiet smile. "You chose well," the man said. Victoria glanced briefly at Ethan before responding. "I believe so." When the dinner finally concluded and guests began moving toward the ballroom exit, the board members remained gathered near the stage. Harold Whitmore watched Victoria and Ethan approach the coat area with a thoughtful expression that had replaced his earlier confidence. Ethan noticed it as well. "Your board looks much less comfortable now," he said quietly as they waited for their coats. Victoria accepted her wrap from the attendant and turned toward him. "Tonight forced them to rethink their narrative," she replied. Ethan slipped into his coat. "The narrative that you are unstable because you refuse to live like they expect." Victoria studied him for a moment. "And what do they see now?" Ethan answered calmly. "They see a CEO who suddenly looks very stable." For a brief second, Victoria Hale's carefully controlled expression softened into something more genuine. The hotel doors opened, and the cool night air of Chicago swept inside, As they stepped back onto the illuminated entrance steps, cameras flashed again as reporters waited outside, eager for one more photograph of the mysterious new couple leaving the gala together. Ethan glanced toward the cameras and then toward Victoria. "You know," he said quietly, "this pretending part might actually be convincing people." Victoria looked out at the city lights stretching across the river and the distant skyline beyond. "Yes," she replied softly, "it might." But neither of them said the thought that lingered silently between them as the car door closed and the cameras faded behind them. Pretending had already begun to feel surprisingly natural. The town car moved quietly through the midnight streets of Chicago as the lights of the Grand Regency Hotel faded behind them. Inside the car, the atmosphere felt different now, calmer, almost reflective after the intensity of the gala. Victoria Hale sat near the window, watching the skyline slide past in long ribbons of light. Ethan Parker leaned back slightly in his seat, loosening the collar of the tuxedo that had felt comfortable an hour ago, but now reminded him how far he had stepped outside his normal life. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The city hummed around them with distant traffic and glowing office towers that still held late-night workers behind their glass walls. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Well," he said quietly, "that was not the worst first date I have ever been on." Victoria turned toward him with a small look of surprise before a faint smile appeared. "You consider that a date?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Formal dinner. Fancy music. Hundreds of people staring at us. That checks most of the boxes." Victoria looked out the window again, but the smile lingered slightly at the edge of her expression. "For the record," she said calmly, "that was the easiest board confrontation I have experienced in years." Ethan nodded slowly. "Your directors looked very uncomfortable." Victoria folded her hands together in her lap. "Their argument depended on the idea that I could not present a stable personal life." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "And now you have a husband who apparently works in your own company." Victoria glanced toward him again. "A husband who understands their tactics." The car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street lined with tall trees and elegant homes set behind iron gates. Ethan looked through the windshield and noticed the enormous stone house ahead, softly lit by warm exterior lights. "I assume that is your place," he said. Victoria nodded once. The car stopped in front of the entrance, and the driver stepped out to open the door. The night air felt cooler now, carrying the distant sound of wind moving through the leaves above the driveway. Ethan stepped out and looked up at the house, taking in the wide windows, the tall columns, and the quiet scale of a place built for someone who carried enormous responsibility. "You realize," he said thoughtfully, "this house is probably larger than my entire neighborhood." Victoria walked up the steps beside him with the calm familiarity of someone who had lived there for years without thinking about its size. "You will get used to it." Inside, the house was quiet and softly illuminated by warm lights along the hallway walls. The marble floor reflected their footsteps as they walked into the large living room overlooking the dark garden beyond the windows. Ethan looked around slowly. "Your board wanted you to appear more traditional," he said. Victoria placed her evening wrap on the back of a chair. "Yes." Ethan folded his arms lightly. "Marriage accomplished that." Victoria nodded. "For now." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier silence in the car. This one was calmer, almost thoughtful. Ethan walked toward the tall window and looked out at the quiet trees beyond the garden. "You know something?" he said after a moment. Victoria glanced toward him. "What?" Ethan turned slightly, his voice still calm and steady. "Tonight, everyone believed our story." Victoria studied him carefully. "That was the objective." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Yes, but something else happened." Victoria waited. Ethan looked around the quiet room again before answering. "For a few hours, we believed it too." The words lingered in the air between them. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees and the distant city lights shimmered beyond the garden walls. Victoria Hale, the woman who had built her life on strategy and control, looked at the quiet man standing in her living room and realized something unexpected. The contract said 1 year. But for the first time since she proposed the arrangement, the future felt less like a plan and more like a possibility.